Aloha, pals. Welcome to Being in the Way, Part 8. This one really could be called The Way of Hiddenness, Part 2. But for differentiation's sake, we've given it its own title, and it's called The Way of Quiet Prayer. And it is a direct outworking of what we talked about last week, where Jesus sort of warned preemptively, a couple thousand years before anybody coined the term virtue signaling. Jesus spent a fair amount of the Sermon on the Mount sort of pointing to one of the most provocative and difficult to discern traps that maybe there is in the spiritual life. And it's this whole function of performing righteousness, that we can be so busy, caught up in our act of performing transformedness, that we effectively insulate ourselves from actually being transformed. And in today's talk, it's just a bit of a deepening of the same idea, where Jesus moves the arena from the stage of public spectacle, the eye of others, to the inner stage that we can unknowingly construct and perform on, this stage where the performance is really just for ourselves and God. And Jesus warns us that this sort of performing can be quietly destructive to the human soul. And so this talk is all about prayer, honesty in prayer, silence in prayer, quietness in prayer. When I was younger, I read St. Paul's sort of command that we're to pray without ceasing, and I found no encouragement in this. I thought to myself, my gosh, I can barely get started praying before my mind wanders off into all kinds of wild avenues, let alone pray without ceasing. Because prayer, as I had been taught or conceptualized it, was sort of a mostly one-way monologue going on between me with God as my audience. And I found it difficult, as interesting as it normally is to hear my own voice. I found it difficult to even to conceptualize the idea of that becoming constant. And so somewhere along the way, I concluded, I must be doing something wrong. So I talked to the prayer ladies and acquire texts on spiritual disciplines and kind of commit myself to getting a better handle on this whole prayer thing. And all of that effort, well-intentioned though it was, all it really served to do was convert my, I think I must be doing something wrong, into there's must be something wrong with me. I spent literally countless hours in both my personal and professional life trying to find answers to impossible questions, like why these kind of prayers seem to be heard and responded to and these other ones are ignored, why good people suffer illnesses, that the prayers of the faithful gathered at their bedside seem incapable of changing. I heard traveling preachers talk about heavenly prayer buckets, these cosmic buckets that needed to be filled with the prayers of the saints before they would tip, get God's attention and cause God to act. And even in my 20s, hearing these concepts for the first time, I remember thinking, that's a strange expression of mercy. And also, it seems to once again center the human ego right in the middle of it, as the one who affects change, the one who eventually, convinces God to move. And so prayer, if prayer works, then why do so many of us seem so frustrated by it? So Jesus told a parable that honestly, at the surface read, seems to just kind of exasperate these problems. Let me explain. When his disciples asked him to teach them how to pray, he told them this parable. He said, "In a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, 'Grant me justice against my adversary.' For some time the judge refused, but finally he said to himself, 'Even though I don't fear God or care what people think,'" it's kind of a little interesting inner monologue, "but because this widow keeps bothering me, and I'll see to it that she gets justice so that she doesn't eventually come and attack me." And the Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says. Will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will God keep putting them off? I tell you, God will see that they get their justice, and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on this earth? So parables work through identification. We subconsciously determine what each character represents and then how we can apply it to our lives. So in this story, who would be the God character? Well, it would be the one that has the power and the authority, right? It would be the judge in this case. And then who would be the character that represents us mere mortals? Well, that would have to be the persistent widow, right? It seems accurate. So that makes the most traditional interpretation, something along the lines of, keep praying. Keep praying until God hears and God changes your situation, because look, if even a jerk like this judge is moved to action through persistence, then God is definitely going to help those who persist in prayer. That's almost the setup of the story, if you read the text in Luke. But here's my question, okay? So whatever your opinion of Jesus, most of us agree that he was a master storyteller. And so my initial question is just this, couldn't Jesus, a master storyteller, find a better correlate for God than this guy? What about this description of the judge is similar or congruent at all with the way that Jesus normally talked about and described the nature and character of God? And the widow? The widow might be even more problematic. Is this supposed to be us? Are we meant to identify with this desperate and unhinged woman whose persistence has tipped over into causing the judge to fear for his physical safety unless he acts? Is that I've had days like that, but weeks, maybe months. Anyway, my question remains, does this strike us as the healthiest model for prayer? So I'm workshopping a few titles for a book that I'd like to have Zondervan publish about this parable. So I'd appreciate your thoughts in the comments section down there, but I'm just spitballing here, right? Okay, so how you like this one? Harassing God. Subtitle: You've annoyed others into giving you what you want. Why not do the same with God? Or how about this one? A spiritual war of attrition. Learn to outlast God and finally get everything that you want. We all love an underdog story, but this is a little much. And aside from that, the scriptures themselves contradict this interpretation. Galatians 3:3, St. Paul writes, "Are you so foolish that after beginning with the Spirit, are you now trying to attain your goal by human effort? Prayer is human effort." Is that what we're talking about? Here's a little theory of mine that I'm wondering if we'll be willing to try on. So you can send a text message, and you might mean one thing, and the words that you send mean something very specific to you. But because there's no way to communicate tone via words on a page or words on a screen, the meaning of the message might be radically misinterpreted. Realistically, understandably so. Part of me wonders if what's going on in this story is just that. But what if the whole thing is just a joke? A joke that Jesus told with a twinkle in his eye and sort of a knowing wink, A joke whose setup is the absurd characterization of the main characters in the story. And the reason for that absurdity is to point to, I don't know, the sort of ridiculous notion that this is how prayer is meant to work. And I think there's some validity in this if you consider the closing line of the parable, which to me is a very odd interpretation of what it might mean. This is the interpretation that Jesus is quoted as offering to his own story. He says that when the Son of Man comes, he might find basically a lot of spiritualized effort. But will he find faith? Will there be any faith on earth? So faith apparently is something other than this. And quite frankly, the Hebrew concept of prayer is something very different from this interpretation. So for whatever reason, it is almost second nature for us to kind of divorce Jesus from the tradition that he was a part of. Like Jesus didn't come, as far as I can tell, just from reading the Gospels, it does not seem Jesus meant to start a new religion. Christianity, as we experience it, was not the goal. Jesus appeared to consider himself a Jewish rabbi whose intentions, rather costly intentions, were to reform his own tradition. And the Hebrew tradition, where he taught and spoke and lived and thought from, had a couple of thousand years to come up with pretty specific ideas about what it is we're talking about when we talk about prayer. So by my count, there are at least 10 words, 10 Hebrew words that can be translated into prayer in English. But far and away, the most repeated, the most common of all these words is this Hebrew word, tefillah. And tefillah translates, in essence, to judge oneself. The most commonly used Hebrew word for prayer means honest self-evaluation. Not pray for change or understand God's motives, and there are other words that mean that, but they're significantly less common. Instead, we get this word tefillah, and it means see yourself. Look in the mirror. What if prayer is meant to change our mind about God, not to change God's mind about us or our situation? Because maybe God's mind doesn't need changing. maybe it's our mind that does. So to see yourself, to judge oneself, is the most common Hebrew understanding of the function of prayer. And, that really reveals that a lot of what constitutes prayer, at least as it was taught to me and attempted by me, is a cluster of behaviors that unintentionally act as a kind of defense against meaningful self-knowledge. And meaningful self-knowledge is the true foundation of any real change, is it not? And, that's exactly where Jesus goes next, because he tells two parables in sequence in Luke's gospel. And the second one goes like this. 2 men went up to temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, a religious leader. The other was a tax collector. Pause there. So Jesus is living in Jerusalem, in Israel. Israel is an occupied nation. They're occupied by a massive empire, the Roman Empire. Rome, for better or worse, attempted to allow the cultures of the nations who they have subjugated to largely remain intact as long as the people are cooperative. One of the things that the people resolutely had a difficult time with was the issue of paying taxes, because you're essentially kicking in more than your fair share to ensure that the military who is subjugating your people and crucifying your sons and daughters is decently well funded. And so collecting taxes was notoriously difficult. And so Rome's solution was to essentially find turncoats, people who are a part of the subjugated culture who are willing to go on the Roman payroll to harass and collect taxes from their countrymen. Okay, so that's the tax collector. They were not commonly used as the hero in popular stories of the day. So 2 men went up to temple to pray. One of them was a religious leader, and the other was a tax collector. The religious leader stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this guy, this tax collector over here. Because, as you know, God, I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of everything that I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance, and he wouldn't even look up to heaven, but instead he beat his breast and he said, God, have mercy on me. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. Because, and this is one of Jesus' most common refrains, everyone who exalts themselves will just end up being humbled. And everyone who chooses to humble themselves will end up being exalted. So if there's a goal in mind, the goal is to humble oneself. And I can tell you from about a decade's worth of experience that there may be no more effective way to humble oneself than actually really getting to know oneself. Like to take an honest look and a non-defensive assessment of all of the schemas, the the patterns, the programming, the self-righteousness, the self-loathing, the fear, the ache, the grief, the goofiness, the absent-mindedness, the lack of genuine concern. You know, there are layers and layers and layers of wounds and traumas and patterns that are just playing themselves out and that we very easily mistake to be ourselves. And that is difficult to look at. It's also like the only way home, because the truth of who we are, as much as we'd like it to be, is not discoverable out there somewhere. There are helpful mirrors and guideposts along the way, but ultimately, to experience salvation, which is wholeness, which is union, which is the point of this whole experiment, it requires us to bravely, courageously take the rather treacherous walk to the truth of who we are by way of seeing, accepting, acknowledging, and ultimately shedding all of these defensive layers. 1,500 years ago or more, a fellow named St. Augustine of Hippo said, "You, O Lord, took me from behind my own back, where I had placed myself because I didn't want to look at myself. And you set me before my own face, where I discovered that you were within me, and it was I who was outside of myself." Thomas Merton wrote, "There is only one problem on which all of my existence, my peace, and my happiness depend. And that is to discover myself in discovering God. Because if I find God, I will also find myself. And if I find my true self, then I will also find God." All right, so with all of this in mind, the fact that Jesus was a Jewish rabbi, and when he spoke about prayer, he didn't need to lay out the foundations as we just had to. We can assume that those listening in his original audience would have been operating from a similar framework. So with all this in mind, here is today's verse, mostly in closing. Okay. Jesus says, "And when you pray, don't be like the hypocrites," which means actors. "For they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others, and they are seen. But I tell you that that's their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to the one who's unseen, who sees what's done in secret, and who will reward you. And when you pray, you don't need to keep on babbling like the pagans, for they think that they'll be heard because of their multiplicity of words. You don't need to do that, because your Father knows what you need before you ever ask him. When you pray," Jesus says, "go into your inner room." And it's safe to assume that to his original audience, they would have understood the inner room to be this inner chamber of the heart, because most people lived, kind of in a one-room flat back in his day. So go into the inner chamber of the heart and close the door. And that expression in Greek can be translated to like opportunity also. So go into the inner chamber and close off, at least for the moment, any other opportunities, maybe pulling you this way and that. And there in the quietness of your heart, resist the urge to fill the space with words. Because the truth of it is, most of the time, we don't even really know what we want, let alone what we actually need. Wisdom says if that is the human condition, then it may be much more beneficial for us to learn to listen, because God knows what we need before we can even put words to it. Just wait and listen. And in the waiting, we begin to recognize that what we need isn't out there somewhere, that what we need is here. It's always here. What we need is here. So the work of prayer, maybe, isn't to change one's circumstances or even to understand them. I mean, that is a bottomless pit. The work of prayer is to learn how to truly see ourselves, to see the world as it is in this moment in time, to accept reality as it actually is, which sometimes involves forgiving reality for being what it is, instead of holding a grudge against it or wearing ourselves to the bone trying to change situations and circumstances that are well beyond our control. And the beauty of accepting our circumstances, our plight as it is, and I'm sure you found this in your own life, but it's like acceptance of things as they are is the doorway into meaningful change if it's gonna happen. Acceptance precedes change. And acceptance sort of broadens our scope off of the obsessive, almost tunnel vision focus on what the problem is and why it needs to be changed. So acceptance kind of helps us to sit back, and it broadens the scope, and it allows us to find and to see and to cherish the beauty and the mercy and grace that is always present. It's always here. One of my all-time favorites, this writer named Frederick Buechner, said that if you were to distill his life's message, and he lived to be 90-something, I said if you were to distill his life's message into one thing, it would be this: listen to your life. See it for the fathomless mystery that it is, in the boredom and the pain of it, no less than in the excitement and the gladness. Touch, taste, smell your way to the holy and hidden heart of it, because in the final analysis, all moments are key moments, and life itself is grace. Simone Weil observed that attention, taken to its highest degree, is the same thing as prayer. It presupposes faith and love. Absolutely unmixed attention is prayer. I don't know if that moves the command to pray without ceasing into the realm of possibility for you, but I find this practice much more meaningful and possibly accessible than my previous idea of prayer as unending monologue. Prayer is attention. Attention invites us into the moment. Attention reveals that, like, the closer we look at anything, the more fascinating it becomes. Attention is also mercy and grace, because, we can wander. Our mind can wander. Our minds will wander. And we'll get caught in worry and anxiety. And we'll get caught in monologuing. And when we do, and when we notice that we've been caught again, the place where we're noticing that we've been caught again is the part of us that's already home. So just seeing that we're stuck, the place where we're seeing from is the place we're trying to get to. Because as St. Francis said, what you're looking for is where you're looking from. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being you. Stoked to see everybody at our next All Together Now, which is going to be on June 21st, 2026, which is also Father's Day. So, love y'all. See you soon. Peace.